Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Trumos, Chapter 1, Halacha 4. In the art scroll, we're on 12a1. This is a beautiful Mishnah and a beautiful set of halachot. The Mishnah is going to deal with two topics in here. They're going to look unrelated, but they're very related. So the second topic is going to be about measuring Trumos. You're not allowed to measure Trumos. And that's going to have an asmata from the Torah. And in Numbers 18:27, it's going to say regarding Trumos Meiser, it says that your Truma shall be reckoned to you. And the way the Rambam understands that is that implied within here is a wish for the Torah to say that you're not supposed to measure the Truma. You're supposed to do it by estimation. Now, many Rishonim are going to say, and it's an asmata, but the Rambam has a stronger view on that it's really an implied wish. In other words, reckoned to you means that it's not supposed to be a precise measure. And also, the thing with Trumos is that there's not a measure that's written in the Torah. Many things are written in the Torah for other sets of tithes, but the Truma Gedola doesn't have any measure written. And the Rambam understands this in his Mishnah Torah in Hilchos Trumos 3:4 as that the Torah does not expressly forbid measuring out precise quantities of Truma. Why? Because it doesn't give a specific amount. It doesn't write it down. And then the first part of the Mishnah is going to be 5 groups of people that they should not separate out Truma, but if they did, it's going to be valid Truma. Now, this group gets split into 2 categories. The first category is going to be somebody who can't say the bracha, so like a mute, right? So somebody who can't say the bracha. And the second category is going to be somebody who's forbidden because they can't take out the best. In other words, the Truma and the tithes are supposed to come from your best. So it's going to talk about a category of people like a drunk person who's not going to be able to discern what is the best. And how is this going to be related to the measure? Well, somebody who, can't really, like a blind person or a drunk person, how can they use these tools to measure it? Now, I will give you a story from my own personal background. I was up in the north in an orchard, and one of the things that I noticed was that when they're collecting very large quantities of fruit or other produce, the quantities are gigantic. And if you had a situation where you had to measure precise amounts, I don't think that the farm or the orchard would be able to work very well because how do you do that on such a large scale when you have a rush to get things ready for a harvest? And you have a limited time to get a lot of these things off a tree and over to the market. And if you have to do precise measures, you would end up where a lot of people might skip it because maybe they would not have the measuring tools to do something so precise on such a large scale. And so the Torah implied within here is calling for people to do a estimate. And one of the other things that comes up is that the estimate is going to be around 2%. And there's a Gemara over in Peah that talks about that. It's in Peah 1:1 that talks about minimum and maximum measure. And one of the things in Trumos is that technically it doesn't have a minimum measure. So even if you took out 1 barley corn, did you technically separate out Truma from it? You did, but really the sages are saying it's supposed to be around 2%. And then what about a maximum measure? In other words, can you take all of your grain pile and leave it to be Trumos? And the answer is no. You have to have a portion that is hulin, in other words, unconsecrated, that's left over. So in here, these are all going to be by estimates, and the idea is that you have to separate it out by a guess. It's not by precision. Now, the other tithes are by precision, and it has to be by precision for, say, Meiser, or say like Meiser Rishon, or the Trumas Meiser. Those are going to be by exact amounts. And why do those have to be exact amounts? Because as you see in Masechet Demai, I believe it's in chapter 5, that you get into a problem where if you're under tithing one pile, you're over tithing the other pile, and vice versa. So that what happens is in one pile, you always have a little bit of tevel left over. So either if you over tithe in your Trumas Meiser, in your small pile, you have a little bit of tevel in your small pile left over, and if you under tithe it, then you have a little bit of tevel in your bigger pile. Now, the Truma Gedola is not going to be like that. You're just going to separate it out by estimate and not by precise measure. So let's get into the Mishnah. The 5 following people, says the Mishnah, that should not separate out Truma, but if they did separate out Truma, the Truma is valid Truma. That is going to be a mute person, a drunk person, an unclothed person, a blind person, and a Baal Keri. Baal Keri, by the way, is somebody who had a seminal omission. That it says that they should not separate Truma, but if they did separate Truma, the Truma is valid Truma. Now, again, we have 2 categories. A mute person, how can they say the bracha? A Baal Keri, they're not supposed to say the bracha. And also the unclothed person, you're not supposed to say brachos while you are naked. Now, what about the other set of categories? Well, if you have a drunk person or you have a blind person, how do they come to separate from the best of the quality of the produce? They can't, because either they're inebriated and they can't determine it because they're mentally impaired, or they are blind. So the next topic is going to say that in the Mishnah that one may not separate Truma by measure, by weight, or by count. Now, some of the produce is going to be sold by count. We covered this in Masechet Demai. One such case, I believe, was going to be fenugreek stalks. Those are going to be sold by count. So in other words, by number. Some things are going to be sold by weight. What was going to be sold by weight? Well, it's customary in Eretz Yisrael that grain is sold by weight. So for instance, a sa'ah of grain, that is going to be around 45 pounds. And then you have some by measure. So what could be by measure? Well, let's say by olive oil. What if you're going to do a luggin of olive oil? Well, that's going to be a liquid measure, and that has a certain size, certain volume, and so those are 3 different ways. In other words, you can't separate out Truma by measure, by weight, or by count. It says now the converse. Mishnah says something brilliant. It says, but one may separate Truma from that which is measured, from that which is weighed, and from that which is counted. Now, why would it say that? Well, it's saying, like, if you have a pile of grain, and if your pile of grain is normally going to be measured by weight, sold by weight, well, if you decide to take out the Truma from it, and you're not going to be doing it by precise measure, but this is normally going to be separated out or sold out by weight, you can do it on the grain. But you're, again, not allowed to separate an exact amount. Now, what about something which would be measured? Well, let's say you're selling luggins of olive oil. Well, you can't sell or do tithes. You can't do a tithe on something with a luggin of olive oil unless you're going to do it by estimate. Now, the olive oil is normally sold by measure, but you can't do it in an exact way. And also that which is counted. Some product is going to be counted, sold by count, like the fenugreek stalks. The fenugreek stalk, by the way, has 2 uses. One can be used as human food. One can be used as animal food. And it says, the next part, it says that one may not separate Truma with a basket or a box that are a known measure. So what would this be? Well, let's say I have, my luggin of olive oil bottles. I know it holds exactly a luggin. And now if I'm going to use that to have a bigger vat and to take out, I have a very, very big vat of olive oil, and I take my luggin bottle and I dip it into the vat to take it out. Well, I know I separated exactly a luggin. So while you're trying to go by estimate, right? Trying to separate by estimate, but the problem is your measure now is exactly precise. You know exactly how much is in that bottle that you took out. You took out exactly a luggin. So that's a problem. It says, but one may separate out truma using half or a third of them. Now, let's say we have the luggin bottle, and I'm taking out approximately a third or approximately half. Now, this is also going to be where there's not a marker on there. In other words, if I have my luggin bottle and I have it marked at where exactly a luggin is, but I also have it marked exactly where half a luggin is, and I filled it up to the half measure mark that's marked on the bottle, well, that's a precise measure. But if there's no marker on there, and I know that the whole bottle is going to be a luggin, and I dip it in, and it's more or less around a half, but it's not exact, well, that's going to be just fine. And that's what the Mishnah is talking about. And it says that, but one may separate truma using a half or a third of them, and one may not separate truma using half the volume of a sa'ah container, because half a sa'ah container is a precise measure. So in other words, if you had a container that was used to measure out a sa'ah, that would be indicating exactly what the half sa'ah is, and then you filled up the sa'ah container halfway, then that would be a precise measure. And so then other people are going to come up and say, well, I know that, this is a precise measure. So I want to reframe this a little bit. So imagine our luggin bottle, okay? So really, the luggin bottle, if I know it has approximately a luggin in it, that is going to be fine to use for a half measure as long as there's no markers on it. But if I'm using now where I know that this is exactly a luggin or exactly a sa'ah, and now I'm taking down by half, that becomes more problematic. If you're doing by estimates and it's not exact, that it holds about a luggin, and it's not exactly calibrated, then that's going to be another story. Now, the Gemara is going to get into a lot about the drunk person, and we're going to get into it. So we have these 5 categories of people that are forbidden to separate out truma, and the Gemara says that some of them are disqualified because of their inability to recite the blessing that has to be said before the separation of truma. And some of them are disqualified because they're unable to separate truma from the choicest produce. In other words, this first part of the Mishnah divides into 2 categories, and the Gemara explains which is which. So it says, the mute, the unclothed person, and the Baal Keri may not separate out truma. Why? Because of their inability to say a bracha. Now, in the case with other mitzvahs, somebody who's going to separate truma is rabbinically required to say a blessing beforehand. And there's a bracha that you can find in the commentary by the Rambam on exactly what the bracha is. It's saying that, blessed are you, it talks about Hashem, and who has sanctified us with his commandments and has commanded us to separate out the Truma. And you can also find this in Yerushalmi Berachot 9.3 and also the Bavli 91a and Berachot. And one is obligated to say the blessing, but the failure to do so does not render the Truma designation ineffective after the fact. Now, somebody who's a mute obviously can't say blessings. Therefore, they're not allowed to separate Truma. But if they did, the portion he separated becomes Truma. Now, by ruling that the designation by a mute for Truma is valid after the fact, that's implying that Truma does not need to be separated orally. In other words, there's a mental designation that's going to be enough. And that's what we covered in Chapter 1, Halacha 1, that there's this mental designation with thought that has to be there. And the statement is going to be a rabbinic thing. Now, you have the naked person. The naked person does not recite blessings because he's not allowed to say a blessing when his genitalia is exposed. And this, by the way, comes from the Torah. It's in Devarim 23:15, where it says, so that he shall not see a shameful thing among you. Gemara is saying, what is the shameful thing? It would be like shameful speech. And if you're going to interpret it like that, it's teaching that when somebody speaks of Hashem, one's shame, in other words, private parts, shouldn't be seen. So since a naked person is forbidden to recite the blessing for separating the Truma, he may not separate Truma in the first place. Now, what about the Baal Keri? This comes from Ezra's decree, which, by the way, was annulled. And nowadays, a Baal Keri is not forbidden to recite blessings, and he also may separate out Truma. And the Rambam, by the way, covers in his list of those who should not separate out Truma, and the Baal Keri is not in that list. So the Baal Keri is dealing with Ezra the scribe, and he decreed that somebody who has the seminal emission, that he has to go to the mikveh first before he's saying brachas or he's doing prayer. And so if you're following the time where the Baal Keri laws were in effect, then the person would not be able to say a bracha, so how can he separate out Truma? But again, as we were covering with the blind person, and the Rambam's pointing out that the bracha is a derabanan thing, but the mental designation, as we saw in Trumos 1:1, is a doraita thing because of the word thought for separation. It also shows that there's intention. Now we get to the other class of people. This is going to be somebody who can't judge what is going to be the best. You have to separate your ties from the best. That's what the Torah says. Now, what about the drunk person? We get into a bit about other dealings with the difference between somebody who drinks and somebody who is drunk, because there is a difference. So Abba bar Rav Huna says in this Gemara, one who drank wine may not pray the Shemona Esrei prayer, but if he did pray the Shemona Esrei, his prayer is counted as a supplication. In other words, he fulfilled the obligation to say the Shemona Esrei. But the next part is a drunk person may not pray the Shemona Esrei, and if he did pray the Shemona Esrei, his prayer is blasphemy. This, by the way, comes up in brachos, both in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. And in the Bavli, this is going to be, in this is covered in the Mishnah Beur in 99.2, and it's also covered in the Shulchan Aruch in 99.1, and basically the drunk person, his prayer is called an abomination, both in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, and not only that, but the Shemona Esrei that you did wasn't a Shemona Esrei. You didn't fulfill the obligation of Shemona Esrei. What did you do as a drunk person doing Shemona Esrei? You made an abomination. So you have to wait until, by the way, the wine wears off, and then you can do your prayer. So what about this difference between somebody who drank wine and somebody who is drunk? Well, there is a difference. What are the differences between the two states? So again, somebody who drank some wine, if he's going to have the mental capacity, not being drunk, to go and to think about what is the right thing to separate, what is the choicest produce, and also has the ability to have thought in a clear way, well, that's going to be Truma. And he also can say the bracha. But the person who is drunk, not only can he not use thought because he's inebriated and impaired, but he also can't pick from the choicest, and he's not really supposed to be saying brachas anyway when he's drunk. And so then implied within this is going to be, well, some of these brachas, are they going to be closer to the Shemona Esrei prayer, or are they going to be closer to, like, say, food, right? If you are drunk and you're going to eat some figs, are you allowed to say the bracha on the figs? You are. But you can't say, as a drunk person, you can't say the Shemona Esrei. So in separating out Trumos, is that going to be closer toward the Shemona Esrei prayer, or is that going to be closer toward a drunk person just saying a bracha before and after eating some figs? So the Gemara is going to look at these two states, and it says, what is the definition of someone who drank? And it says anyone who drank a revis. And it's going to be, by the way, exact, and it's not either more or less. And the Mishnah Beur in 99.2 is saying that the revis of wine does not affect intoxication unless it's drunk in the pure, undiluted state. And that pure, undiluted state has to measure the revis. And we know from Masechet Sachim that you can water down the wine a little bit for the 4 cups. It's in chapter 10. And now the Gemara looks at the next part. It says that a drunk person is someone who drank more than a revis. And the Gemara gives the definition for a drunk person. There's a different one. It says there in Bavel, they said a drunk person is anyone who drank so much wine that he can't speak appropriately before the king. So the definition is going to parallel what the Bavli says in Eruvin 64a. And according to this view, someone who drank more than a revis of wine does not have the status of the sheker, it's a drunk person, if he's still able to stand and speak before a king. Now, certainly in prayer, you're standing before the King of Kings. So the Gemara gets to another law. It also comes up in Brachos, in the Gemara, both in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. And it says, Rabbi Zera asked before Rabbi Issi, it says, what is the law as to whether the drunk person may recite the Birkat Hamazon, in other words, grace after meals? And so normally a drunk person is not allowed to pray, and the prayer for the Shemona Esrei certainly is invalid after the fact, but maybe this is just going to be limited to Shemona Esrei. Maybe it's not going to be for other prayers. Maybe because Shemona Esrei requires intense concentration, because somebody has to be like that they're standing before a king, and that comes up in the Gemara and Brachos. So the question is, what about these other prayers? Is a drunk person going to be, also required to be at that level of speech as well? And Rabbi Zera gets his reply from Rabbi Issi, and he says back to Rabbi Zera, he says that the Torah states you shall eat and you shall be satisfied and you shall bless. In other words, talking about Birkat Hamazon. And this, by the way, comes up in Devarim 8:10 as a source for saying Birkat Hamazon after the meal. And it's implying that even, says this Gemara, someone who is so drunk that he can't speak appropriately should still say the bracha for Birkat Hamazon. And both the Bavli and the Yerushalmi and Brachos comes up with the same conclusion. In other words, that you can say the brachas for Birkat Hamazon if you're drunk, because presumably you're drinking a lot at a like a wedding party or something like that. That's the case in the Yerushalmi, or a wedding party. And can you say the brachas? And the answer is yes, but something different with Shemona Esrei. But what about this for Trumos? Trumos requires thought. The Torah talks about thought for Trumos. What about now that bracha? Is that going to be something that's going to be closer to Shemona Esrei? So the Gemara probes this, and he says that the question was warranted only in regard to whether the drunk person may recite the Shema. In other words, if you're learning that the Shemona Esrei is going to be at this very high level, but saying a bracha on food is going to be much more accepted, because it's assumed that you're going to be drinking at a wedding party. That's the Yerushalmi's example. Well, that's going to be one category, and it permits you to do it. But what about saying the Shema? Is that going to be closer to saying the Shemona Esrei, which you also have to concentrate on, or is that going to be closer toward a bracha on the food? And the Gemara doesn't answer that. In other words, that there's a couple of different opinions on this, like with the Vilna Goan. The Vilna Goan is going to be saying that it's obvious that the unclothed person is forbidden to recite the Shema, and to convey that an unclothed person may not recite the Shema, why is it talking about a shameful thing and shameful speech? And the Vilna Gaon is continuing now on the drunk part and saying that that the reference to a drunk person, since he was subject to this Gemara's discussion so far, and the question of whether a drunk person can say the Shema, it's saying that also shameful speech. So the Vilna Goan is coming up to the conclusion that because the Torah is talking about shameful speech and saying that, well, either the naked person or the drunk person would be saying, like shameful speech, and so he's saying that both this and that would be subject for the Shema. In other words, that he's saying that the drunk person is not supposed to say the Shema, but he is allowed to say this other bracha, which is going to be Birkat HaMazon. Now, the Vilna Goan is going to be understanding it as a more strict opinion. The Ramban Nachmanides takes the opposite approach, and he's going to be saying that the Shema is going to be closer toward because the amount of intention and concentration is not as long as Shemona Esrei, that you can say it, and so the Gemara leaves it unanswered. Now we get into other questions about the Shema and separations, and it says Abba Bar Avin said that one pious person once asked Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet, who was remembered for good, what is the law as to whether an unclothed person may recite the Shema? And Elijah said to this pious person that the Torah says, so that he shall not see a shameful thing, which is going to be Ervas Devar among you. This is going to be, again, from Devarim chapter 8. And so the word Ervas Devar can be rendered Ervas Dibor, which means shameful speech. In other words, it can be vowelized like that. So if you're going to interpret it like that when somebody's speaking to Hashem, that one's shame should not be seen. And that's kind of how the Vilna Goan is coming up with this more strict interpretation and sort of reading it like this. So although Eliyahu Navi is addressing the question about the Shema, the Gemara now wants to look about a prohibition now toward the food. What about now for Birkat HaMazon? And Hiskiah, who by the way does take a very strict opinion on this, teaches in the Brisa that an unclothed person is forbidden to recite both the Shema and to do Birkat HaMazon. This, by the way, is not necessarily the halacha, and is also not necessarily the conclusion that the Yerushalmi comes up with in Berachot. Now, the Mishnah continues, and it gets back to the next part about measurements. And it says that one may not separate Truma by measure. And the Gemara looks about a contradiction between this Mishnah and one that comes up later. And the one that comes up later is going to be in chapter 4, halacha 5. And it says, we learned in the Mishnah there in chapter 4, halacha 5, that one who counts his units of produce is praiseworthy, and one who measures his produce is more praiseworthy than he, and one who weighs his produce is more praiseworthy than the three of them. In other words, the increasing amount of praise is increasing according to the precision of the weight. And so the Mishnah is praising somebody who measures the produce for tithing accurately. And yet the Gemara says, yet you say this. In other words, the Tana of this Mishnah forbids precise measurement. Now, the Gemara is going to answer what's the difference between this one here in Trumos 1:4, which says that you can't, and the one over there in 4:5. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi answers it like this. He says, here in our Mishnah, we're dealing with Truma Gedola, and there in the Mishnah, we're dealing with Trumas Meiser. And as I mentioned before, for technical parts, the Truma Meiser has to be precise. Why? Because the Torah says that it's supposed to be a precise amount. The Torah gives a precise measure for Trumas Meiser. And so because there's a precise number given, you have to do it with a precision. But there's no precise number given for Truma Gedola. In other words, Truma Gedola is done as Rambam has pointed by the Gemara that he's referencing to over here. Rambam's saying that it's wishing that you don't do it by precise measure because it doesn't give you a measure to do. But Trumas Gedola, Trumas Meiser and Meiser Rishon does have precise measures attached to it. So the Gemara is going to give support for this answer. In other words, that there are two things. There's a total of 5 tithes, and the Truma Gedola is the first one that comes out, and so this one is going to be by estimate. The other ones are going to be by precise measure. So the Gemara teaches a brisa that teaches like this, that Elazar ben Gomel says, from where do we know that one may not separate Truma through measuring, weighing, or counting? And the Torah states, your Truma shall be reckoned to you. This, again, is Numbers 18:27. And so this is saying that the word reckoned is meaning estimate. Okay, it doesn't give you an exact number. It's giving estimate. And interpreted like this, the verse teaches that you may separate Truma through estimation. And it's saying that you may not separate Truma through measuring, weighing, or counting. This verse draws an analogy between Truma Gedola and Trumas Meiser. And Gemara says, therefore, just as Truma Gedola is separated through estimation, so is Truma Meiser separated through estimation. In other words, this Tana, which is going to be Eliezer ben Gomel, is holding that both Truma Gedola and Trumas Meiser are separated by estimation. And just as Truma Gedola is, so is Trumas Meiser. This, by the way, is not going to be the way we follow. That's not going to be the tradition. So the way that we have it today is going to be that Truma Gedola is going to be by estimate, and the Trumas Meiser is going to be by precision. So the Gemara raises another problem with the Mishnah's prohibition against precise measure. It says, but we learned in our Mishnah, one may separate Truma from that which is measured, from that which is weighed, and from that which is counted. So why is this permitted when the Mishnah forbids a precise measure of this nature? The Gemara answers, Rabbi Lazar says, this is what the Mishnah means, that one may measure his tevel when bringing it into his house, as long as he does not separate the Truma through measuring, so that the Mishnah is prohibiting only the person to measure the Truma itself, and one is allowed to measure the tevel before he brings it into the house, where he will separate out the Truma. So it's preferable to measure one's tevel before separating out Truma, because that serves to improve his estimate. So the next part of the statement says that one may weigh his tevel and bring it into the house, as long as he does not separate the Truma through weighing. And one may count his tevel and bring it into the house, as long as he does not separate the Truma through counting. So the idea is that you're talking about somebody who's taking out the tevel and weighing it, and then he's separating out the Truma after that. And they're saying that that's going to be a preferred way to do that. By the way, when does the Truma get taken itself? That's when it's going to see the face of your house. And so in other words, that, it's saying that it's preferable to measure the tevel before separating the Truma to try to get, to keep an estimate. In other words, that you're not saying that you're measuring out what's left in an exact amount. You're trying to get an approximation of how much tevel you're going to be left with. And tevel, by the way, is going to be something that you can't eat without having your tithe, so you have to still take out the tithe. Now, getting back to Eliezer ben Gomel's point, is that not just only precise measures, but even estimates are going to be valid, and he's going to basically be saying that you have a link between the separation for Trumas Meiser and Truma Gedola in the Torah, and again, that is not the tradition that we have today, and the Mishnah it does not seem to be holding by any of that position by Eliezer ben Gomel, and in the opinion of the rabbis, who do not have a scriptural source validating estimation for Trumas Meiser, it's forbidden to rely on estimation for Trumas Meiser, and it's only the opinion of Eliezer ben Gomel who derives from scripture that an estimation is allowed. And so, again, the question is that, what is the tradition that we have today? And the tradition that we have today is going to be that the Truma Gedola is going to be by estimate, and the other ones are going to be by precise measure. And so if you're looking at precise measure, like what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is saying, that, the Truma Gedola is by estimate, and then over there in Trumos 4:5, we're talking about the other Trumos, the Trumos Meiser, which is going to be by precision. So anyway, that covers for measurements, and so the bottom line is that the Truma Gedola is always by estimate and not by precise measure. And then in Halacha 5, we're going to get into separating Truma from olives to olive oil again. And we're going to go with the opposite case. What happens if you have olive oil and you're going to try to separate that on behalf of olives? Have a great day.